fire ignites the sulfur, which brings forth a bright flame, so that the charcoal catches fire. The fire then suddenly sets free a wind from the saltpeter that kindles this ember. It is this wind that thence moves the bullet." End quote. This is how the process of burning gunpowder was imagined in the 16th century. Many such imaginative descriptions were based on the work of the famous Italian scholar Niccolò Tartaglia, who was the first to apply math to investigate the trajectory of cannonballs, the discipline we today call ballistics. Gunpowder was a technical innovation that lastingly changed the face of European warfare and culture in the late medieval and early modern times. Even though early gunpowder weapons were ineffective, they fascinated military artisans, who over time tweaked them into absolutely essential weapons for any successful military operation. This is how contemporary historiography tells the story of gunpowder. The first piece of evidence of a chemical mixture considered as gunpowder goes back to 9th century China. Chinese alchemists, who were looking for an elixir of life, noted that their newest experimental concoction wasn't healthy at all, and very easily inflammable. The name of that mixture in Chinese was Huo Yao, which means fire medicine. In the 11th century, the oldest written formula of a gunpowder mix appears in the Wu Xing Zong Yao, a compendium of military techniques of the time, but such early formulas didn't contain enough saltpeter to create an explosive. Some also included rather surprising ingredients such as honey and garlic. The first military use of the fire medicine is dated to the 10th century, when it was used to make gunpowder arrows, usually referred to as fire arrows. It didn't take long until its military use was expanded to other arms, such as rockets, bombs and landmines, and towards the end of the 13th century to the first simple hand cannons. Most present-day historians are confident that gunpowder was invented in China and then transferred to Europe. However, there are some scholars who argue that gunpowder, or at least its use in firearms, was developed in Europe independently from China. The three notable historians, Stephen Morillo, Jeremy Black and Paul Lococo, for example, state, quote, "The Chinese do seem to have invented guns independently of the Europeans, at least in principle, but in terms of effective cannons, the edge goes to Europe." End quote. It is a major blank spot in the chain of evidence that it isn't clear which route gunpowder took from China to Europe. Although the Mongols are often considered the likeliest vector, historians such as Timothy May point out that there is no evidence that they used gunpowder weapons outside of China. Additionally, other inventions, such as the compass, took centuries to reach Europe, while gunpowder only took about 50 years. Bear in mind, however, that there are no European records of the early evolution of gunpowder and gunpowder weapons like the ones mentioned from China. As the historian Tonio Andrade states, the earliest formulas for gunpowder in Europe appear later and are already very close to the ideal proportions to create an effective explosive and propellant powder. But there are also similarities with Chinese recipes. Thomas Arnold notes that early European and Chinese gunpowder recipes have identical defects, such as superfluous and useless ingredients. One important difference, however, is that early Chinese sources use terms such as fire drug or fire medicine for gunpowder. These imply a civilian use, while Europeans used it almost exclusively in military matters. Whatever the truth may be, the first European to mention gunpowder was the English philosopher Roger Bacon, who in 1267 described firecrackers in his Opus Maius. The earliest unambiguous evidence of firearms in Europe is an illustration in an English manuscript dated to 1326. While those very early guns certainly impressed contemporaries, they weren't effective at all. It was only in the late 14th and 15th century that gunpowder weapons became more effective and gradually replaced other long-range weapons in Europe, when decisive improvements were made in refining the mysterious black powder that nourished these firearms. Early experiments quickly underlined the efficacy of three ingredients: charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur. Charcoal is the fuel of the chemical reaction, saltpeter supplies oxygen, and sulfur lowers the temperature required to ignite the mixture. Charcoal was readily available in Europe, but specialists continuously experimented with coals from different woods, Normally, charcoal from hardwood, which had been burned in charcoal piles, was used. Sulfur was more difficult to get by. It had to be mined in volcanic areas, such as Naples, Sicily or Sweden. Saltpeter too was tricky to get, especially in high quality. Initially, it could only be imported from India in very limited quantities. However, saltpeter was found in Europe as well, wherever ammonium nitrate was formed during the decomposition of nitrogenous organic material, that is, urine, muck or dung, which then reacted to nitrate salts with calcareous materials such as mortar. Europeans induced this process on purpose as early as the 14th century. However, procuring saltpeter remained a central bottleneck in the production of gunpowder until large deposits were found in Chile around 1820. Once all ingredients were assembled, they were refined and purified by grinding them down to fine powder. This was done in powder mills, with wooden stampers powered by a water wheel. This grinding process was extremely dangerous because the ingredients could ignite involuntarily due to the heat produced by friction. Learning from tragical accidents, the mills were built in isolated locations, and the working materials were cooled down with water, vinegar or urine. From about 1420 onwards, the powder was no longer used as extremely fine powder, but rather as grain powder. At first, primarily in heavy cannons. In order to corn the powder, it was first stamped, then dried in bulbs, and eventually broken into roughly equal pieces or pressed through a sieve when still damp to get equally sized grains. Corned powder was less prone to get wet, and the ingredients couldn't separate during transportation, as was often the case with fine powder. Quickly, experience showed that corned powder caused much more powerful explosions. Consequently, fine powder was soon only used as a primer to trigger ignitions, but not to fire bullets, and transported separately in small powder flasks. In the 16th century, technical improvements enabled the use of smaller corned powder for rifles and pistols as well. The corn size was adapted to the weapon it was intended for. In addition, the amount of powder and the mixing ratio changed. Both were important to guarantee an effective deployment of gunpowder. Experts in this field were called master gunsmiths. These reputable specialists developed improved recipes and wrote them down in books which were often richly illustrated. Apart from the composition and corn size of the gunpowder, the form and material of the guns had to be considered in order to make sure the process of shooting functioned properly and safely. This was quite a field to master, especially because it was only in the middle of the 16th century that some standardization in terms of guns and gunpowder took on. The quality of gunpowder increased steadily throughout medieval and early modern times. In the 17th and 18th century, many European countries set up state-controlled manufactories, which combined all steps of production in one central place. This led to a marked increase in quality. However, in the mid-19th century, the advancement of explosives flattened the outstanding importance of gunpowder. After the American Civil War, industrially produced smokeless explosives on the base of nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, such as dynamite in 1866, overhauled it quickly.